Hi class, welcome to Module 6. We're looking at Chapter 5. How does gender matter for whom we want and desire? I spent a significant time this summer trying to update myself on the research in the area of sex and gender. It's interesting how much has changed and how much information we have available to us that was never there before. We've come to understand that gender has powerful issues that impact us in every way and in everything we do. We've also learned that sex, the act of sexual intercourse, the act of caring for someone, the act of love, has significant meaning and purpose in people's lives. So, you've already invested time in movies and readings on gender, so you can easily guess how gender matters to who we are and what we desire. So, this particular chapter looks at those sociological issues. So let's go back to thinking about those issues. Hard to study, aren't they? If I come and I ask you, what's your sex life like? How did you fall in love? What pieces are together? Even with a more modern society, you may feel uncomfortable with measuring those. We can see that in the past, it was even more difficult as times changed. We were very much in that Puritanistic or Victorian era, Victorian with the love mode, Puritanistic in the fact that we didn't talk about sex. But the world wasn't always that way. So as you review this chapter, I think it's really important that you go back and see how things have changed and how they're continuing to change. In fact, I've taught this course 3 times. And in those 7 years that from the first time to this time, there's been significant change in how we view society and sexuality and that gender piece coming into play. Now, the university has chosen not to use films on demand anymore. So finding appropriate films on sex and these gender issues is really difficult. I was lucky enough in the first few modules to get to what are considered scholastic films. There is no way that I could reach scholastic films for this particular module. So your information throughout this will come mainly from the textbook. You have 2 quick videos that we will watch within this, one on sexual scripts and roles. So just some the sexual objectification and of women in particular, but you can place that over to men. Remember, every time we talk about any issue, we need to look at those multiple sides, and we can't study just women or men or homosexuals or heterosexuals or bisexuals. We have to look at it all within the process. The second video looks at the gender roles and how they were defined and that historical piece that comes into place. And it's kind of just a lesson at a lower level than college per se, but a good one to help us evaluate those gender roles that come into place. So let's flip over to the PowerPoints, but we'll make this relatively fast, and I'll rely on you to be as analytical and critical thinking as you are currently being in the discussion posts I just read for discussion 2. So, hold on. So what are we talking about within the look at Does it make a difference who we want or how we behave in that process? Or does it matter with whom we desire? The studying of sex and varying sexual behaviors. Sex is the act is defined as sexual, potentially much broader than just intercourse. It's the romance piece that goes with it. It's the touching. It's the advances more beyond genital intercourse or anal intercourse or even oral sex. It is all of those behaviors coming together. Romantic love involves that connection that comes into place in family and American family systems. We talk about the types of love and how they come into place and how we connect and how it's brought together then through that sexualization, and it connects to it. Romantic love involves couples coming together, sharing the excitement, those erotic relationships, feeling united with each other. And emotional intimacy is that sharing of the aspects of the self for mutual understanding. You can see that not always do we get to that level of emotional intimacy. And then this also involves the study of sexual identity, the characterization of people, the biological, the psychological, the cultural measure of what brings us to sexual desire. And let's be honest, not all people have sexual desire. Within this chapter, we'll talk about people who are asexual, about 1% of the population. So, does sexuality have a gender? And the book goes through this at a significant level as we look at this imaginary world that's created. But let's talk about the heteronormity and the compulsive heterosexuality. We've really come to understand that this is the way that life should be, heterosexual. And if you look historically, this was not always the case. Heteronormality is a way in which heterosexuality is viewed as the norm and the natural way of being. And it focuses on the power and the privilege that comes to being heterosexual in the process. So as we look at this, we need to go back and look at that historical piece. Sociology often has to go back and look at the past to see what we create in the present. But prior to basically the 19th century, we really did not define heterosexual, homosexual in a many way. If you look at Greek life, the Greeks believed that love for a fellow man was more powerful than love for a woman. And sexual intercourse was acceptable. You weren't considered homosexual to have sexual intercourse with another man because you still had the wife into place, since they were seen very different. Women were seen as inferior, and sex basically was driven by that view of a man and what was appropriate in many places. So the history comes into place, and us seeing that there was not this clear definition and there were not clear boundaries that came into place. Heterosexuality is seen as given. It's seen as the norm today, homosexuality being viewed as needing to be explained. Now, I think it's very interesting when you read the chapter talking about buggery. It was considered, in other words, anal sex was considered deviance. And it wasn't just with a man and a man, but a man and a woman, or a man and an animal. And therefore, there was a call against it. But it wasn't defining someone by that behavior. So it's very different than what we look at today. Now, Kinsey's research in the 1940s started to look at human sexuality in the United States. Now, think about the 1940s. It was difficult to exactly measure. He had volunteer subjects that came into place. In fact, when Kinsey was looking at the level of homosexuality, he rated it as a much higher level than we currently say today. We're saying about 6% of the population is homosexual, 1% asexual, bisexual, we don't have good numbers on. But when Kinsey was doing it, he had volunteers. And people who were willing to talk about their sex life were oftentimes more modern, more exploratory, but it gives us that base to come forward. And he really proposed these categories of homosexual and heterosexual as a continuum. I think that kind of makes sense today when we look at people at those different levels that we start looking at how those sexual behaviors. People engaged in same-sex behavior didn't always identify themselves as homosexual as he starts to measure that process. But it gives us the base of starting to look at sexuality and coming forward. Now, men as sexual subjects. We see this link between gender and sexuality as important. That there is a sense of power that comes to maleness that allows them to act within that. We see that military sexuality complex, which is part of the way in which sex itself is militarized. And it motivates soldiers to fight. It assumes men have a greater need for sex as we see them as sexual subjects. Women as sexual subjects, women are seen as sexual objects. You're going to have a video on that just briefly about that sexualization of women. There's some interesting research that comes out of this as well as we start to explore that. But seeing oneself as passive and a recipient of sexual behavior and sexual desire, being one sexually acted upon, really comes into place in some of this process. And their view of a woman as being put there on a pedestal. Think of the Playboy and the sexualization in that process. Girls often see sex as happening to them, not as part of it, and they believe in this ideal love. We even see the sexualization as we start talking about the literature that people read and what's acceptable in a romance novel for a woman versus a man. And we see these sexual scripts coming out and confronting this issue is part of what we need to do, is coming into place. And part of this you can already see is going to grow into the other chapters as we look at this sexual objectification of women that puts us together in a pursuit of this perfect body, this perfect look. Now, stepping forward to this particular slide, women sometimes pursue sexual encounters as well as men. And they, well, all experience this whole appeal of this romantic tourism that exists. Now, romantic tourism describes the way in which many women as sexual tourists are looking for more to be swept away by men, to assert their strong control over their paid male counterparts. So we see this where these erotic men are perceived as better to romance, and we can see the consequences that come forth as we talk about double standards. Double standards are important to consider. Think about when you were first starting to date, if you dated, and were there rules different for the female or the male in the home? What were the rules that came forward? What were the standards that were expected? What were the behaviors looked for? Double standards still exist today, and we can see it strongly here in the difference of accepting men exploring in the region for sexual tourism versus women. Sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are the learning guidelines for our sexual expression, how we're supposed to behave, what's appropriate, and basically the sexual desires of a particular culture. So sexual scripts are one way of understanding sexuality. They're based on social construction. Now, into sociology. All of this, when we think about how we define gender, how we look at it, is a social construct. And a social construct means that it's derived by the culture around it, what is expected in society, and we put it together and say, this is the way that women are supposed to behave, this is the way men are supposed to behave, this is the way people of these categories should behave. And yet we know that things are very fluid, that sexual scripts define us, they help us understand who we are, but they're also part of the issues that we explore here. According to sexual scripts, men should be initiators of sexual behavior, right? We see this through the study that your book talks about. Sexual scripts vary by culture. We see that the desire and the place. We even see that both the Quran and the Bible talk about some of these issues. Women's sexuality is not seen as passive in the Islamic culture as much as it is in the Eastern European culture. And we see the differences that can arise. Now, as you finish this particular piece, you'll look at that very difference coming into place. And we'll move on to looking at bisexuality. Now, bisexuality is a recent concept, and basically Freud believed all humans were potentially bisexual, that we could have attractions to both sex for romantic love. Bisexuals are often stigmatized by both heterosexuals and homosexuals, and bisexuals refer to others as monosexual, multiple sexual choices within that process as we start exploring. Again, the research is only starting to build to understand that at a deeper level. Mentioned asexual before. At the research I could find say that about 1% of the population is asexual. It's the emerging category of sexual identity, that an asexual person who does not experience sexual attraction of any sort, that they have no romantic drive and no desire to find a romantic partner. In one of my classes a few years ago, I had a student actually write about asexuality within the family as he chose that for his research project paper. It's interesting as we explore what goes on in this particular category. Well, I warned you that much of this will come from your own reading. There's very little to do with this particular module other than these 2 quick videos and entering your discussion board. You also have multiple choice in your questions because there's so much different in this particular chapter. So you can choose from question gender exercise number 2, 3, or 7 this week if you choose to do the exercise. And don't forget, you only need to do 10, so work it around your schedule, which is best. But I think as you move forward to the discussion in this particular chapter, are both men and women harmed by this gendered belief of sexuality? What are the advantages and disadvantages of being perceived as a sexual object? Are there advantages? Yes and no, and what do you think? And is inequality part of this issue? So I'm really asking for you to continue with that very good critical thinking you've been doing on this topic as you move forward. Next week, we'll move on to the impact of who we spend time with. And I'm hoping that you can see the basis here leading into the rest of the things that we look at, including family, work, jobs, employment, all of that tied to this particular piece. With that said, have a great week.